So, medieval castles. I'm sure you've seen a million of those. They are grand structures that come in many shapes and sizes, but the thing is, they're usually above ground. I mean, it makes sense since people live above ground, but wouldn't it be cool to live underground? The answer is no. No, it would not. Caves are cold, wet, and dark. But I like the novelty of an underground city, and who said Minecraft was a realistic game? So I gathered some builders to help me out and started on this odd project. Also, I'm going to start streaming on Twitch soon, so check out that channel. Anyways, back to the video. The first thing I need to do is work on the cave. This cave needs to be big enough for the city, and so this is a somewhat reasonable place for residents to live. I allowed for a giant hole at the top of the cave. It allows some light in and just makes the scene way prettier, which is what I'm going for. With the terrain settled, we began to lay out the build. I mainly worked on the castle for most of this project, so we will go through on how I did it. This upper area of the terrain will hold the castle because a grand building deserves to be seen from afar. The first step was to lay out the outer walls of the castle. I merely followed the terrain, but I did make a few changes afterwards to make it less ugly. Though I made two distinct areas in the walls. The larger area will of course hold the main palace, but the smaller section will be the main military area. A castle needs its guards. Going back to the walls, I added some layouts where I want some towers. Then it was time to lay out the castle. I had an initial draft of a potential castle, but it turned out really bad. Like, where's the wow factor in this version? It doesn't even look like a castle. So I completely scrapped it and restarted from scratch. A good looking castle starts from the foundation, so getting a good shape is paramount, which is what I got wrong the first time. Now that I had the hang of things, I was able to get a much better shape done. Just look at the difference between the two versions. Now it was time to work on the details. So I started on the outer walls since those would be the easiest to detail. I just colored the walls, detailed the towers, added some arches, and added some battlements. Pretty simple for the most part, but I did do something slightly different on the back and added windows to the walls. Thought it was a nice switch up on the walls to add more dynamic details. Looking back, I may have added way too many windows though. Now it was time to detail the main section of the castle, which I kinda dreaded since I made it so big. So I went step by step. Started with the entrance area, added a front door, windows on the sides, and detailed the roof. Now that I had a section detailed, I now had an idea on how to proceed with the rest of the build. It was then pretty smooth sailing for the rest of the build. I went section by section, detailing them in ways I thought made sense. I mean, the detailing was pretty simple for the most part since it was just adding windows, but the simplicity made it much easier to detail the castle quickly. Soon I reached the top and finished detailing the main palace. However, there was still work to do. As I worked on the castle, BH and Milan both worked on the military training area as well as the courtyard. They did a fantastic job on both. I also added a mini garden area near the top of the castle in order for it to be not so bare. But BH made a suggestion toward the end. Let's fix this ugly tower in the back. So we got to it. We refined the detailing of it to make it a lot better and redid the coloration in order for it to fit the rest of the castle. And it turned out much better. Now going back in time for a bit, we had plans for a city in front of the castle. So I laid out the initial groundwork for it. I laid out the city streets and the harbor for the city. This rock was a little island in a large underground lake, so there needs to be a way to enter and leave the city. So the first area we focused on in the city was the harbor. Ash started off this section by making the first harbor building, which turned out very nicely. BH and Milan would then continue the work by adding more buildings, some boats, and a small market. Since this was a primary way for the city to have contact with the outside world, it would make sense to have this port seem busy with the boats and market stalls. But this was only one part of the city. There's still a lot of city left to be made. The last thing that needed to be completed was the actual city. ATAJ and BH worked on some schematics that turned out really nicely. ATAJ came up with the original color palette, and BH designed the 7 buildings that we will use for the city. However, I wanted to add another unique building to the town so it doesn't look all the same. I decided to add a library building. So I looked for a nice design online and then laid out the design. It was a nice design with a cool tower sticking out. Once I had that laid out, Milan and BH would finish the detailing. They both did a really good job with the windows in the roof. The touch I really liked was that BH made the top tower white, which really makes it stick out. I then placed all the buildings along the roads I laid out. I didn't want to overuse the larger buildings too much, so I primarily used the smaller buildings to fill out the city. Now that the buildings were placed, I needed to add some sort of road between the buildings so the floor doesn't look all plain. I struggled for a bit to find a block combination, but I settled on this deep slate pattern. Now it was the final stretch. I added some lampposts to the street and some plants around the houses. The plants add a little bit of life to the town and some color as well. And yes, it is possible for these plants to grow. There is a giant opening in the cave after all. I added a little bit of extra clutter to the streets and added a small marketplace at the center of town. And that will complete the build. I think it turned out really nicely. There are some things I can improve on in the future, but it was nice to experiment with something a little different. This map will be downloadable on our website, so check it out if you'd like. Thank you again to all the builders that helped on this project. But now it's on to the next.